welcome to Commentators Corner, which is part of Féile and Phobail. In this, we are going to be looking at some of the key political events that have happened in 2021. We're also going to do a wee bit of a look ahead, and we've got a very distinguished panel to do this. We have Alison Morris from the Belfast Telegraph, we have Chris Donnelly, who's an Irish News columnist, we have the journalist Amanda Ferguson, and we have former DUP Special Advisor and commentator Tim Cairns. You're all very, very welcome. I'm going to start off with, of course, the big story of the year has been the DUP leadership. There have been 3 DUP leaders in the space of 7 months. So I'm going to start with you, Alison. What have you made about the drama within the DUP, a party famous for its discipline, seems to have all fallen apart in 2021? What's happened?
Well, I'll tell you what I didn't make. I didn't make as much as Tim was making that week, let me tell you, because he was on every broadcast channel going. Well, look, it was fascinating for a number of reasons. This is the, centenary year of the formation of Northern Ireland. This was meant to be unionism's big year. This was meant to be the big celebratory year. All that was good about Northern Ireland and protecting the union and all that. And all of a sudden, it just looked like unionism was devouring itself. I thought that the very public nature of it was very interesting. As a journalist, it was brilliant because they were, people were leaking like sieves. There was all sorts of briefing against certain people. I think that the first leadership campaign would get off to a really bad start when they banned the 2 candidates from speaking publicly. And that's probably where things started to go really wrong very quickly. Because it looked, even at that point, that what was going on behind the scenes were people being coerced, what was happening, but nobody was getting to lay out their stall. What was the difference between these 2 men? What was the difference in policy and style? All of those sort of things. They should have been out front and centre answering those questions, and they weren't. But I mean, I know that I joked on video that I had bottles of shampoo that lasted longer than Edwin Poots' leadership. But I mean, it was remarkably short. I didn't think he was going to stay leader for very long. I thought there's a year left, a year this man at the most. But like, not even I could have predicted it ended as quickly as it did. We had hardly time to, dust off his new office when he was straight back out the door again. But I think that now we can see that there's a real attempt by Jeffrey Donaldson to try and unite the party in some way. But also, I think to try and put out a more positive message. Any interviews he's done, he's trying to use very positive language and trying to make out that everything is all fine. But you gotta wonder how much of those tensions are still just slightly beneath the surface and when they'll all explode out again.
Okay, Tim, as Alison's been saying, it's been a very interesting, busy few months for you. Edwin Poots, of course, wins the first DUP leadership ballot, 19 votes to 17. And it all implodes within 3 weeks, the shortest serving leader in UK political history. What's going on, Tim?
Well, I think there's really sort of an inward-looking reflection, I think, by DUP MLAs particularly, and that's really what happened with the ousting of Arlene Foster. I think there have been rumblings for quite some time internally within the DUP MLA core. They felt neglected. They felt that their views weren't being listened to. They felt that policy was being made and they were being told what that policy was. There were a small number of advisors, and Arlene Foster and Nigel Dodds, and they were the people that were making all the decisions. And I think there was a lot of the MLAs felt that they were a hostage to somebody else's fortune. And I think that's really what Edwin Poots and those around Edwin Poots, Ian Paisley Jr., Paul Givan, I think they were really able to tap into that feeling at the time, and they were able to carry 19 MLAs with them. But I think very quickly people realised things hadn't got better. Big promises being made by Edwin Poots that he was going to bring the MLAs in, that they were going to be in the decision-making process. This wasn't just going to be some special advisors, some chief executives, press people who were going to be advising the leader, and then the leader be making decisions. And at the first opportunity that Edwin Poots had to show that he was going to be more democratic than Arlene Foster, he failed. And, clearly the party weren't with him whenever he was going to nominate Paul Givan. Clearly the party wanted to wait some time longer to see what was happening. Whatever it was, they wanted sorted out, and whatever, comfort the MLAs wanted or needed, Edwin Poots being the man who had stood foursquare on the platform of putting democracy back into the DUP. At his first opportunity, he flubbed his lines. And then I think the MLAs stopped looking inward and started looking outward at that point in time, and they thought, goodness, well, we didn't get the democracy that we wanted in ousting Arlene Foster, and we've actually lost something in electability with Edwin Poots. So therefore, we might actually be in a worse position. And I think that's what happened throughout that day. Very quickly, people got buyer's remorse. And I think a significant number of the 19 who had voted for Edwin Poots got the receipts out and took their leader back and decided they wanted to get a new one.
Okay. And Amanda, what did you make of, Arlene Foster was ousted in a particularly brutal manner. It's very unlike the DUP to do that so publicly. What was your take on how she was ousted as DUP leader and First Minister?
The whole thing was just exhausting. It was wild. I remember, I do a lot of work in Britain on radio station wise, and trying to explain to them what was going on was a challenge in itself. And I think that the ousting had obviously been in the mix for a while, but then once it happened, it was like you didn't know what to do next. Like there was no plan beyond getting rid of Arlene Foster. And I don't think people liked the style in which it was done. You were talking to people, outside Crown Plaza when Evan's ratification event was on, people saying, no, I didn't like the way they did that. And it just, there was nothing positive about it for Edwin Poots. He didn't even get like one day of a honeymoon. There was no sort of moment of glory where he could, revel in his big moment. It was just flat out pressure, from the very minute that it happened onwards. And I think that the good thing about it, out of it for me, was that I made 50 quid at the bookies because I had put money on Edwin in the first time round. But I think the actual favour that has been done, all this, that has given a bit of stability whenever it seemed as if the DUP was really spiralling really badly, is the fact that Paul Gibbons in place as First Minister. And I know that that's the thing that has led to Edwin's downfall. But the fact that he's there kind of in a caretaker role until they work out what's happening, I think is probably good for unionism. Okay.
And Chris, what have you made about, obviously centenary year for unionism, and I doubt the DUP wanted their contribution to be, three leaders and potentially 3 First Ministers?
Yeah, I think, in terms of the centenary, it's been a bit of a damp squib, I think, for unionism. And part of that, of course, is the pandemic, I think, which would have put any type of celebrations or planned commemorations and the like on hold. It would have been muted regardless. But I do think the context and within which things have developed and evolved over this year has been particularly bad for unionism. I know that the other contributors have talked about what the DUP have faced. And I do think there's an element of what Machiavelli talked about. If you've got bad news, try to get it all out at the one time. And I think the one good thing the DUP might look back on is that, almost if you look back now in a blink of an eye in terms of history there, it was over. The Poots period came and went, and Alison still has that bottle of shampoo, probably. And in one sense, you could see us moving 4, 5, 6 months down the line, and it'll almost be like, God, do you remember, Edwin Poots' period of times later? But at the same time, those divisions clearly are there. Those frustrations that led to that, the tensions that boiled over, were a result, I think, of many things, not least that authority had broken down within the DUP over a period of years. That high water mark of the 2016 Assembly election where the DUP reigned supreme. Sinn Féin Nationals really took a bad hit that year. And then things went sour, the collapse of the Assembly, RHI, and Brexit. And of course, that is still what I think is the backdrop, what's going on. And, if one thing, whilst, yes, Paul Gibbon being in position and Jeffrey Donaldson making that move and trying to quell the storm in one sense will help at the moment. But I do think that the real destabilizing moment that could, the next one could be if the Ulster Unionists do register electorally some type of revival next year. And I think that's probably what's causing the most anxiety within the DUP at the moment. If there is any type of narrative, it's one thing saying, hey, we've lost Alex Easton and people coming out and saying, the DUP is getting narrow. And, I don't think the DUP would be necessarily unnerved by Julianne Core joining the Ulster Unionist Party, maybe not even Ian Marshall. But if it's proven at the ballot box that the Ulster Unionists are back, then you could see more internal tension boiling over within the DUP about the direction of travel that the leadership's taking them.
So I just want to take it a step back, Alison. So obviously, with the departure of Arlene Foster, what do we make of her 5.5-year leadership? What is the Foster legacy? She was the first female First Minister that we had, and I know she's now gone off to GB News now. But what is her legacy? How will we look back at her 5.5-year period as DUP leader?
As a woman, I have to admire someone who came to within such, a patriarchal party that was set up by, middle-aged men in suits, and managed to rise to the top of that party in the way that she did. But we talk a lot, about pulling up the ladder behind you and more female representation in politics. It doesn't necessarily mean that representation is better for women. So, Arlene Foster is very conservative in her politics. She continually used her time as leader to block reform and all sorts of social issues, be that abortion legislation or same-sex marriage. She wasn't a reformer. She didn't go in and change things dramatically. I do realise that for unionist women, and especially young women, she is a role model, and we have to, accept that. My politics will be very different from hers, but you can see that she'd be a role model for young women. But she's by no means a feminist, nor I'm sure would she describe herself as such. I think that, it was such a game of two halves, because if you remember at the start, it was, almost a presidential style leadership. I mean, if you remember that election where Arlene was on every poster, we started calling her Arlene as though she was Cher or Madonna or something, stopped even using her second name. Do you know what I mean? She's so famous, we only need one name. And they really embraced that in the party. Arlene's on fire. This was all great. And then, my goodness, how her star started to fall, and you could see the mixing that was going on behind the scenes. And we know that, had Edwin Poots been able to manoeuvre out of that position sooner, he would have. He's seen his chance to go for, and he just timed that very badly. If he had have left her where she was and let the Secretary of State come in and implement all those controversial strands of legislation, such as the Irish Language Act and everything else that was going along with it, and then afterwards came along and ousted her and went, well, that was all Arlene's doing, that wasn't anything to do with me, he might have been more successful. Her transfer into broadcast is interesting, and the GB News, we've talked about this during the week. It's very different to be interviewed by someone, to switch yourself over to the other side and start interviewing someone. We've seen people try that in the past, maybe not very successfully. We know we have people like Mike Nesbitt who went into politics from the other way and went that other direction. But that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be really good at interviews just because he's interviewed people. To be, a sort of Mark Crothers type figure and to command that sort of respect and gravitas when you're interviewing people takes a lot of training. And I'm not sure how she's going to do that. We did see a bit more personality from her, and now she's unshackled from the DUP. She seems to have developed a personality and is a bit of crack, and maybe she brought that to it. It might be more entertaining, but I mean, I don't know what the interest in the viewers of GB News is in Arlene Foster's style of unionism. The people who are watching that are basically English nationalists. That would be their views and their politics. And I'm not sure they really care about what was on here. And I'm not sure how she's going to tap into that audience and make them interested. I know that there's been a lot of interest publishers in her. And I assume that there's a book already in the pipeline, and I will definitely read it and definitely assess it. But I mean, it was, I suppose for unionism, wasn't the most unsuccessful period of leadership. She managed to grow the party, and then obviously things went drastically wrong after RHI. But no, I mean, from a female point of view, if I was talking about was it good for women in Northern Ireland, I don't think she particularly left a legacy in that respect. Okay.
Tim, what about you? What's the Foster legacy for you? You actually got to work with her, so you know her a bit better than, a lot better actually than the rest of us. So what for you is the Foster legacy for 5.5 years?
Yeah, I think when we look back on the Foster legacy, I think it'll probably be, we'll be interested to see what Jeffrey does and how he takes things forward. I think when we look back at Arlene Foster, it's going to be up and down. I think, Arlene, she managed to reach some heights, but very quickly seemed to self-destruct and crashed back down to earth. And then she would reinvent herself again and seemed to be crawling back up to the pinnacle. And then somehow she would manage to self-destruct again. And I don't know quite, how she managed to do that 2 or 3 times. She seemed to get herself out of the hole. She seemed to get herself back on an even keel. And then something would happen. Crocodiles would happen, or, get herself into a whole mess and a whole bind around, insignificant pieces of legislation, as happened last summer. And then, that was the only time there's a DUP MLA rebellion, was over this very minor, very technical piece of legislation that Arlene Foster held to as if it was, Holy Scripture itself, which was bizarre to me as to why she would do that. But that's very much Arlene, I think. And that, that's the Arlene you'd see behind the scenes. I think Arlene's greatest flaw is that Arlene can't be wrong. And I think that's her great success. I think that's what took her to the heights, and she's very confident. She's very sure of herself. But the flip side of that is that when you are wrong, it's knowing you're wrong is quite a problem, because it's interesting, because if you are wrong but you don't know you're wrong, you actually think you're right. And I think that was the problem for Arlene. I think that's how she actually detached herself from the rest of the MLAs in the group. That, you know, they would come there and they would say, and several MLAs said this to me, they had private meetings with Arlene over the last year, 18 months, and they would say to Arlene, the direction we're going in here is wrong. We need to make a change. And Arlene didn't listen to them, you know, politely heard what they had to say, but no change came. And I think that was the problem. Arlene's difficulty was, I think, taking advice behind the scenes to say, look, I think the course of direction we're on is not the right course of direction. We need to pivot to a new way. And I think we actually saw it through the RHI inquiry. Arlene just kept the course. And no matter what anybody was telling her, advisors or whatever, no matter what any of the data was, Arlene just kept on that one course, because she couldn't actually then admit that the course she'd been on was a wrong course and then turn around and do something else. So I think her greatest attribute was also her greatest downfall. Look, I think, you know, if you go back to the very start of Arlene's time in office, I think there was a great exhale amongst, DUP MLAs and elected representatives. Where, you know, Peter Robinson, as great a strategic brain as he was, he didn't quite have the personality and charisma of Arlene. And Arlene had this great charisma, came in a whirlwind, and everybody sort of thought, this is different, this is new, internally and externally. But I think very quickly, that changed. I think it'll depend on how Jeffrey does as to how she'll be judged in history. If Jeffrey's a rip-roaring success, builds on the DUP vote, minimises losses next May, I think Arlene won't be seen in quite as good a light as she may be if Jeffrey's doesn't deliver in the way that I suspect he will.
Okay. Amanda, what is your take on Arlene's time in office? Were you a bit more? We've had two kind of negative appraisals here. Are you willing to kick it up and do a positive at all?
I think it's a mixture of things. I think, it all started off with the coronation. And it seemed to be going well. Like Arlene got the honeymoon that Edwin didn't get, but I think she'll be remembered for RHI. She'll be remembered for the crocodile comments. I think that's a pivotal moment in our history. That was in response to a question that Noel McAdam asked her, a throwaway question at the end of a press conference. I think Brexit. I think the confidence and supply arrangement. I think for being undermined by men in her party. As a woman, I don't think that she's done very much for women in Northern Ireland. I think blocking women's reproductive rights will be something that she's remembered for. I think that it's actually good that she has this GB News platform. Perhaps she may be remembered for some of the efforts that she made around the GAA or the vote on conversion therapy. Other things would be her love of royalty and her little brooch that she likes to wear, and the love glasses, and the peace symbol on the way out of the Crown Plaza into the back of the 4x4 was a bit of a moment. But yeah, I think that she's had a pretty challenging leadership, and a lot of it's to do with her own self as well as being undermined. But even though the confidence and supply ended up being a disaster for the DUP in regards to Brexit, it still made unionism and Northern Ireland's place in the UK further up the list in Britain. That definitely did that. I remember, some of my clients in Britain, I had to go over and do a dummy's guide to the DUP. Who are they? What are they about? What do they look like? What are their things? And even though it didn't work out for a long time, they're going to have to try and sell the benefits of the UK. And if we're looking for a final positive, I would say perhaps this piece of work that she's trying to do around social media, if she could achieve something that would be beneficial for all women, and perhaps it might make up for some of the damage that she's done to women's rights.
Okay. Chris, your thoughts on Arlene Foster?
Yeah, I think if Alison's point at the start, it was a game of two halves, and probably more, if I think basketball terms, game of four quarters. In her first quarter, maybe she had a great outing and then it all went south. But certainly I think the point is, look, if I was coming, and I'm not a unionist, but if I was a unionist, I would say that it was a massive missed opportunity, the tenureship of Arlene Foster as leader. A couple of people have made reference to the fact that she was called Arlene. We called her by her first name. She did, as Amanda said, she had a honeymoon. Edwin didn't get a honeymoon, but he didn't even create the space to have a honeymoon. he was kicked out right away, you know. But the difficulty for unionism now is, whereas Arlene had that honeymoon, had that wonderful 2016 election, Arlene Foster's time as leader represented probably the last opportunity for a unionist leader to sue for the middle from a position of majority strength. And I think that that's now gone. And that's going to be the legacy of Arlene Foster that was on her watch, that at every level of elected representation, from Europe to Westminster to Assembly to local government, unionism reduced itself to minority player alongside nationalism. And therefore, you know, some of the hiccups that you're seeing and the potential problems for unionism in the future, you know, how do they get over this idea of having a Sinn Féin First Minister? Again, from a position of strength as the First Minister, the DUP could have easily got rid of that and said, look, you know, we're obviously the largest party, but we're going to have two, you know, it's a joint office, we're going to have two First Ministers. Things like that can't be done anymore. They're stuck in a position now where they're trying to push back the Ulster Unionists by, you know, promoting fear in the heartlands that potentially Sinn Féin could take this. So, you know, that's just going to create another problem. So I think that's really going to be her legacy, that was on her watch, that unionism squandered the last opportunity to move to try to grow within the centre ground from the position of majority strength.
Okay, Chris, I want to stick with you for this next question. Obviously, the DUP aren't the only party that have had changes within them. Sinn Féin, for example, have been shuffling around their MLAs. Their two sitting MLAs were deselected. They deselected another sitting MLA in South Down. We've seen changes out in Fermanagh, South Tyrone, and there may be more to come before the next Assembly election. What have you made of that? I mean, talk about brutal movements. I mean, what happened in Derry was particularly unexpected and wasn't seen to be coming in that way, particularly with someone like Martina Anderson being moved out. What do you make of the moves within Sinn Féin?
I think they've been coming for quite some time, to be blunt, David. I think that it has been quite apparent within the party. It's talked about, and externally within the Republican base and wider. You know, commentators like this would comment that Sinn Féin do not appear to have been at the game for years now at Stormont. I think there's a sense that they're often off the ball, that they're not dictating agenda, and that in one sense that they haven't reshuffled, they haven't renewed their representation, both at elected rep level and probably at advisory level. And I think what we're seeing is a recognition of that internally. The difficulty, of course, with that is it's how you do it, number one, and number two is, what do you get after it? Do you mean there's no point in causing the trouble and strife that you do in Derry unless the two people you're going to bring in, you know, significantly are seen as improving the prospects of the party, both electorally to advance but also to politically set the agenda. And I think that's the most striking thing that came out of that, what happened in Féile for the party. I did see the logic of that, although I think that, you know, if that was the direction of travel they were going in, then it was a mistake to bring Martina Anderson back in the first place. And I think that shows you how there was a lack of leadership direction in the North as to where Sinn Féin were going. And the fact that, you know, we're now, you know, where we are coming through the summer is they still haven't announced who they have in mind to replace those two sitting MLAs, which, you know...
Why do you think that is? Why do you think they've waited so long?
I mean, if I'm honest with you, I really don't know. I think it's very poorly organized, because if you're going to do what you did, you can't have this period of time where you have so significantly undermined two representatives who, whatever about big picture, and I get that at an elite leadership level, there has to be sometimes ruthless political planning and shuffling that way. I understand that has to happen. But you also have to take cognizance of the fact of how that's going to be perceived internally. You know, how the personnel management that goes on. This has been handled atrociously poorly. And they now also do not seem to have people lined up to take a place. So they've allowed the two elected representatives, and fair play to them, to continue to do what they're doing. But, you know, it has undermined the party in a constituency where they really can't afford that, because I do think they're going to struggle to keep their second seat at the moment. So, you know, I think that experience has probably put the brakes on some of the other constituencies where I think they would have been minded to shuffle people out and bring other people in, probably because they realize they're going to have to, the process is going to have to be handled in a much more much slicker manner.
Okay, Alison, what have you made about the changes within the Sinn Féin Assembly, not just in Derry, but in other constituencies as well?
I think that what happened in Derry, everybody knew that there was problems in the Northwest for quite some time. And let's be honest, a lot of that was down to allegations of cronyism and nepotism and the fact that there was too much control being given to, basically two families. And the disaster that they had in the general election. I mean, they didn't just lose that seat. I mean, they lost that seat in a way that makes it look like they will never, ever, ever retain it again. And to take a candidate who was clearly a very poor candidate in that general election and then put her in the Senate, I think angered a lot of people up there because it just looked like it was literally jobs for people regardless of regardless of their ability, just by birthright. And that annoys people, especially very small cities like Derry. But I agree. But what happened was it was so badly handled because I think someone thought they were being very clever by leaking that on the same day that Arlene Foster was ousted, and maybe had been listening too much to Good Day to Break Bad News, and that was the worst thing that they could have done because it looked like you're taking this woman who has, given her life basically to the Republican movement. I remember many years ago on the anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement interviewing Martina Anderson about the early release scheme and about the prisoners that were released, and her saying about how, she had basically given up her right to have a baby because by the time she was released from prison, that opportunity was gone. And that is an awful lot to give to any movement or organisation. To remove her in that way or seemingly remove her in that way, it looked cruel. It annoyed a lot of people. It could have been handled better. All they had to do was, deselect her for the next and give her a job and let her say she was going off to do something else. It seemed unnecessarily cruel and embarrassing. And that's why I think there's been a lot of backtracking on that. And we've seen that. I think that's the reason why basically the two candidates haven't been announced. They're trying to find a way to do it now in a better way and undo the damage of what's been done. The issue is that, we had two Sinn Féins for a long time. You have the South, which is clearly much slicker in terms of how they handle their press and in terms of recruitment and in terms of how people are paid. Even, this is all. And then in the North, we still have that sort of attachment to the past. And that is an issue that we have to now try and unite those two and make them one cohesive party, North and South. And I think that is what needs to happen now. And to do that, you have to hire people who are, your backroom staff have to be good at what they do. They have to be qualified for what they do and have to be equipped for what they do. And hiring people simply because they are related to such and such is no longer going to be able to cut it in the long term for a professional party. And that is where the changes need to be made. And also what I also find very strange is because there's so many capable young people. Sinn Féin is probably the youngest party, in all of the North in terms of their membership. They have a huge number of very young activists who were in that party, but they're not put front and center. They're not promoted in the way they should be. You got to bring that talent up. And that is where, if you're going to exchange two older MLAs for two of your bright young things, we should know who those people are. They should already be out in the public psyche. We should see them doing interviews. We should see them out and about. Their profiles should be raised. Whether or not there's just a nervousness about doing that and releasing people in, out into the wild to face people like me, I don't know. Or whether or not there's maybe some of the older guard are too precious of their position and don't want those young people being put forward. And that needs to be addressed because that's how you modernise your party. But I mean, they do have a very young membership and a really active, committed. The thing about it is, people who are in Sinn Féin who you would know will tell you the same thing. We're activists, we're not employees. They're there because that is the cause that they believe in, and that can be a very powerful strength. But at times that can also be a weakness because you're maybe using people who are so dedicated and active, but maybe they haven't done the training or skills to do a particular specific job. So sometimes you got to let a few outsiders, I think, in terms of that. So there's a lot to unpick there, and I think that the problem is that you've had a party that for 40 odd years has been wedded to sort of has been obviously wedded to our conflict. They're wedded, to that. And the fact is that they now have to realise that we are now 20 odd years after the Good Friday Agreement. They have a very slick operation in the South. They just need to replicate that in the North and try and make that look like one party instead of this, as if that party ends at the border and a new one starts.
Okay. Tim, what have you made from looking in at the looking in at the Sinn Féin changes, and again, just from that, there does the change in marginal constituencies like South Down and Foyle, does that maybe cast doubt about whether Sinn Féin could maybe even be the largest party after the next Assembly election?
Well, it's also going to be a titanic battle, but I think there's a wider question. It's very difficult, I think, to make changes internally within constituencies in political parties, particularly in this part of the world. Because I think, it's already been articulated, and I don't think this is just a Sinn Féin problem. This is a problem across political parties. People within constituencies become very embedded. Their families are members of the constituency association. Their friends are members of the constituency association. They have these long-standing relationships locally that the people in Belfast, or in Sinn Féin's case in Dublin, don't have those relationships. And it's very hard for any political party, Sinn Féin, SLP, DUP, UUP, everybody's got this problem, to try and change your candidate profile in particular constituencies to try and maximise your vote. And that's a very hard thing to do. It's a very hard thing for people centrally to impose that upon constituencies. And I think, Sinn Féin are finding that out. I think they for a long time have had a highly centralised structure. And I think that they're saying that trying to tinker around at constituencies where other parties have had those difficulties in the past, Sinn Féin are now having those difficulties. I think in terms of who's going to be the largest party after the next Assembly election, certainly that's the prize that Sinn Féin have their eyes on. And I think, I think they looked at it and they saw in these marginal constituencies where they have battles with the SLP and potentially where they have battles with the Alliance Party as well coming up, depending on how the Alliance Party vote grows, or depending what the Ulster Unionist Party can do to eat into the Alliance Party vote. And we see, I think on Twitter, we can see over the last couple of weeks, the Alliance Party are very scared of what the Ulster Unionist Party are doing. I think Chris had said earlier, it's the DUP are scared of the Ulster Unionist Party. Actually, I don't think any one bit of it. The DUP, I think, are quite relaxed about the Ulster Unionist Party. The Alliance Party are clearly rattled by Doug Beattie. If their leadership's Twitter action and reactions or anything to go by over the last couple
Twitter isn't the real world, though, now, Tim,
But Twitter's not the real world. And I think if I was an advisor of the Alliance Party, I would say, what on earth are you doing in senior positions in the Alliance Party? You're being triggered on Twitter, giving ammunition to the Ulster Unionist Party just to come in and start cherry picking votes off you. But look, I think, from the Sinn Féin strategy is clear that they want to stave off any kind of attack from the SDLP, any kind of possible loss of seats to the Alliance Party. And they want to maximise that by, as Alison and Chris have said, by bringing in candidates who have a profile that might be younger, where in constituencies where the Alliance Party might be a problem, the SDLP might be a problem, where a younger candidate would be a bright young thing that looks shiny, that looks new. Certainly that's been the Alliance Party's strategy over the last number of years, bring in sort of shiny, new people into the public arena who are articulate, who can seemingly do a good job. And I think Sinn Féin have seen that and they want to follow that. And look at the SDLP. It doesn't translate into votes, but they've got some very good representatives, and they've been able to bring in some very good younger, articulate, probably more fair to say middle-aged, maybe some of these younger people like Claire Hanna and Colin Eastwood are now moving in the middle age. And I say that as myself. I'm 47, so I'm maybe even going beyond middle age now. So but they are
don't say that.
They are very good. They are.
I was going to say tough paper round, Tim. Tough paper round.
No, thanks, Alison, for that. But I know you're younger than me, so it's you haven't even moved in the middle age yet. But so I think that the Sinn Féin are saying that, and I think that's why we're seeing some of the old guard move, because they don't tap into I think the way that some of those SDLP and some of those Alliance representatives, I think the way they play with the voters that Sinn Féin are targeting.
Okay, Amanda, what have you made about Sinn Féin in Derry and just what the change in other constituencies as well?
Just before I move to that, I actually think that everyone's a little bit rattled by Alliance at the minute, which is why they're kind of being attacked on all sides. I think that Sinn Féin have their eyes on the prize of being in government on both sides of the border. I think that the focus is on the other side of the border at the moment. I think Sinn Féin up in this part of the world have been quite quiet recently because unionism has been in such turmoil. It's kind of just sort of sat back and thought, right, well, you have your drama and we'll just sort of keep a low profile at the moment. moment they have a big job on their hands with Derry and with Féile. I think that they do need to make some good signings, have some sort of like star signings, because you need people who have demonstrated that they're actually doing groundwork and actually doing something for communities. And we know the ongoing grievances that people in the Northwest have about, sort of the chronic underinvestment that's taken place over a long period of time. I think the Sinn Féin's having a wee bit of difficulty at the moment over the legacy stuff because of its association with the IRA. I think that they are very good on the modern side of stuff, on the younger people side of stuff, on that sort of youth activism. I wasn't expecting to see Conor Murphy turning up on TikTok, but there he was. And I think that that's something that they're right to do, because, the voters now that are in charge, the older voters, aren't going to be around forever. And that strength does seem to come through in their younger people. But it does seem to me that they have been quite quiet recently.
And just on let's move it into, we're going to the polls in at least certainly within the next 9 months at most, could potentially be a bit sooner. Although if you live in Lagan Valley, you could be going to the polls twice in the next 7 months. Lucky ducks. Chris, started off the dynamics going into the next Assembly election. I mean, you're already starting to see candidates take shape, particularly with the Alliance Party. As well, Doug Beattie, of course, his first electoral test is UUP leader. I mean, do you buy, one, that the TUV are as high as they are in the polls due to the protocol? And two, do you think that Doug Beattie and Naomi Long pose as much of a threat as electorally to other parties as is being portrayed online?
Before I get to one or two, I just have to say that since Tim Cairns' last contribution, I have got REM's shiny happy people going around in my head. So thank you for that, Tim. And as somebody rapidly approaching 47, I must insist that 47 continues to be continues to have the status of middle age, Tim. So please do not abandon that.
You could be turning 50 or something this year, so don't be worried about that. So.
Okay. In terms of both, it's exciting. If I'm in the Ulster Unionist Party at the moment, I'd be thinking, look, we have a chance now that we haven't had for some period of time. I don't think Doug Beattie's the most polished. I think Mike Nesbitt probably was a better media performer, but that doesn't matter. Often it's about the moment. It's about when you assume leadership, your approach, and what's going on in the environment at that time. And I think Beattie does have, I do take a little bit, I do take Tim's point. I have picked up that Alliance UUP Tetchy exchanges. I think there's a logic to that because Alliance have been picking up so much of that Ulster Unionist vote. So that all makes sense. And pick up the stuff from the Carrick migrants. Alliance pounced immediately on not just why the DUP weren't being vocal other than Mark Collins, but also why they didn't, they were trying to differentiate for their own voters to say, listen, we're very publicly opposing this, whereas the Ulster Unionists are being a little bit quieter, a little bit flyer, because they know that, if the UUP are going to come back, they need to get from the DUP, TUV side, as well as from the Alliance side. So everybody's got their own strategizing. I don't, to pick up your 2 points, Stephen, I don't think Jim Allister, whatever about TUP polling 8, 9, 10% sometimes in polls. Bottom line is there's only one Jim Allister, and he cannot clone himself and put himself in all sorts of.
They do try though in elections. They put him behind every.
Yeah, they do. And I know we made reference earlier to the 2016 Assembly election, which was all about Arlene. But they've tried all about Jim, and it just doesn't work. And often you end up. I don't want to be disparaging, but sometimes you end up in Aintu and the likes of Fownis, you end up with some wingnuts on the ballot papers who people in the media can pick up some crazy things that they've said, whether on social media or elsewhere. And, in pursuit of trying to find more and more candidates, the party brand actually takes a hit. And that's why I don't think the DUP will end up losing as much to the TUV as they certainly seem to be the case in some of the polling up to date. I think Alliance, for the last while now, I've thought Alliance really, because they're starting from a low base. I mean, what are they on? 8 MLAs, David? So, and again, Doug Beattie actually has that on his side too. He's only got 10. MLAs. The Ulster Unionists incredibly are only elected to half of our 18 constituencies. So, to quote Yaz from many, many moons ago, and David, you won't remember Yaz probably, but the rest of us do, the only way is up. And I think that both the UUP and Alliance will try to cling to the narrative. They only have to gain 2, 3, 4 seats. And then it's, hey, we're making a bit of a comeback. I do think Alliance are going to have Alliance on paper at the moment, they could be taking seats all over the place. I know Sinn Féin have reason to be worried. Like North Belfast looks like Alliance should be taking the second Sinn Féin seat. But you're talking about places like West Tyrone, South Down. So many places where Alliance could be making gains. They'll be worried. I think maybe the Ulster Unionists could knock that off track some places. Maybe the SDLP. I think Tim is right. SDLP, often the likes of Matthew O'Toole, great, Amanda talking about signings, a great signing for them. But the thing about the SDLP is, as articulate as they sound and reason at different times, it doesn't really register electorally. Other than, of course, in the 2019 Westminster election, when they had those 2 thumping constituency wins in South Belfast and Foyle. But, they need to see more than that this time around too. So I think it's really going to be interesting. I don't think, to conclude, I don't think Jim Allister is going to be the one who's going to emerge victorious from the election anyway.
Okay, and just quickly, who at this stage thinks is going to be the largest party? At this stage.
I could see both Sinn Féin and DUP losing seats. Maybe the DUP losing 1 or 2 more. Of course, they would have to lose maybe DUP losing 1 or 2 more. So probably Sinn Féin maybe just emerging. I wouldn't have thought that 4 months ago. I would have thought the DUP, but I think now things have tilted slightly. Okay,
thanks very much, Chris. Alison, your thoughts about the election that is forthcoming? What do you think the dynamics that are going to be? Who do you think who's got the most to gain? Who do you think will be at this stage will come out 2 days after count day and they'll be cheering? Who do you think that's going to be?
The person who has the most to gain is also the person who has the most to lose, and that is Doug Beattie. So he is trying to turn this very slow-moving tanker, trying to turn it around. I mean, that party was in seemingly unstoppable decline. I don't know how you even start to turn that around. We can see what his strategy is. So you said Twitter is not the real world. If Twitter was the real world, Naomi Long would be First Minister and Deputy First Minister. You know what I mean? I mean, it's just not real. You have to say that's not what people think about outside. And sometimes we live in a wee bubble where we think that is the opinions of people. But go out into the street and talk to people, you'll find their opinions are very different. The fact of it is that I believe, and whether or not that translates into the polls, that a large number of unionists who switched to vote for Alliance were voting for them despite the fact that they are not a strong, pro-union party in terms of the constitutional issue, but just because that was their values in terms of their social issues. If they had an alternative unionist party who was liberal socially, but strong on the union, I would imagine that was where they will go and vote. Now, whether that is the case or whether those people actually do exist, or I have just imagined them in my head, I don't know. But we will soon see, after the next election, because that is the vote that Doug Beattie's going for. He is saying, leave the preaching to the minister on a Sunday. That's got nothing to do with me. This is our politics. We're going to bring in all these new people. We're going to be much more liberal, but we're going to be strong on the union. Is that a demographic that has not been properly represented lately? The DUP, instead of doing that, and I know there's people within the DUP who wanted to move in that direction, but instead of that, they seemed to be running scared after Jim Allister, who, as Chris said, is only one man. The last time that unionism had a bounce at the polls, which you could compare in any way to the protocol, was after the flag protests. And do you remember in those council elections? And Jim Allister run basically what were paper candidates all over the place, and that resulted in the election of Jolene Bunting. So remember that. And if he doesn't have the candidates with the profiles that he can put into those seats, so people know for their constituency work and know for their work on the ground, and recognise them as someone they'll go to if they need a problem with their housing, or if they're, if their granny's on a waiting list somewhere. They don't have that sort of people, I think, out working there who they can just put into those seats. So that's his issue. But I mean, I do think that the way things are going, that the SDLP's vote will be solid. It'll be steady. I can't see them losing any ground. I don't think that we're going to see a continuation of the Alliance bounce that we've seen in previous elections. I think that was very specific to what was happening at the time around Brexit and around all of those other things. Those things are done now. You can't go back and redo them again. But I do think that we'll probably have a very close election as to who is the largest party, but Sinn Féin will just nip that, I think, and just take that.
Okay, so that's 2 for Sinn Féin being the largest party. Tim, what do you think about the dynamics? Because this is, again, Jeffrey's first election as DUP leader, Doug's first as UUP leader as well. So what do you think will be the overall dynamics and the overall outcome?
Well, it's really been an interesting clash of styles, as Chris has already pointed out, between Jeffrey Donaldson and Doug Beattie. I mean, Jeffrey's going to be a lot more polished on the media. There's no doubt about that. I actually think Doug Beattie's charm is that he's not that great in the media, and I think he doesn't pretend he's any great shakes. I think that's part of the charm, part of the reason why he's popular, because I think he does that very well. I think politicians are at their best when they work out what their limitations are and work within them. And I think Doug Beattie has captured that probably better than anybody else in politics for quite some time in Northern Ireland. And I think he does that very well. I think he stays within, he knows what he can do and what he can't do, and he manoeuvres within that quite well. I do think that when we get the leaders debates, and there's intense scrutiny on those leaders debates, and you've got Jeffrey Donaldson, who's a strong media performer, Colm Eastwood, who is actually exceptional at those leaders debates. He is by far the best of any of the party leaders in Northern Ireland at those leaders debates. And you've got Naomi Long, who's strong in those leaders debates as well. I wonder will Doug Beattie's voice get lost? And I think that's something he's going to have to work on between now and the election. How does he get heard in the midst of that noise? It's all very well, hanging out on a farm with Ian Marshall and all of those sorts of things and making little Twitter videos, and those are all great. But when you're actually in the heat of the battle, and you're front and center, how do you hold up on that? So I think that's going to be interesting to see. So
just interesting, just because you've spoken about the UP, how much do you think Robin Swan, if you go by polls, the most popular politician in Northern Ireland, how much do you think he'll feature in the next UUP campaign?
I think he'll feature heavily. I think it'll be the Doug and Robin show. I think there's no question of that, and I think it'll be, if things continue the way they're going at the moment, Robin Swan still is a strong health minister. I mean, who knows in this pandemic what's going to happen and what's not going to happen.
And largest party, Tim?
Well, the largest party, I think the DUP will be the largest party. I actually disagree with that, Alison and Chris, because I think the DUP can lose 2 or 3 percentage points because they're not transfer friendly. They're not like other parties that they're getting second and third preferences. Very much, if you look at the last election, you drill down into the data, the DUP, don't move very much further from their first preference vote. So they can lose a bit, and they won't lose too many seats. Look, I don't believe the DUP are sitting at 19% or whatever the last opinion poll was. I think they'll come in somewhere around 22, 23%. They'll lose a couple of seats. Sinn Féin will lose 1, maybe 2 seats as well. So the DUP will be a seat ahead, 2 seats ahead, or they'll be close, but the DUP will still be the largest party, I think. And I think Jeffrey Donaldson, I think he's the person who's going to deliver that.
Okay, Amanda.
Yeah, I think that Jim Allister and Saoirse Eastwood are in their election mode already and have been for a number of weeks.
I thought you were going to say something entirely different there.
I think that the Ulster Unionist Party leadership... You're right, Tim. The Ulster Unionist Party leadership has been interesting because almost immediately, unionists in my timeline were saying it was a breath of fresh air. But on the other hand, they were also saying this is a disaster because loads of non-unionists do like him. So if they like him, it means that he's not good for unionism, which was an interesting take. But I think it's been good what he's done with Julianne Core, with Ryan McCready, with Ian Marshall. I think reaching out to young people like Joel Keys has been a useful exercise. I think that Claire Sugden is going to make him work. She has dismissed the opportunity to join the Ulster Unionists now, but she hasn't ruled it out in the future. I think she's kind of maybe a bit like me being a freelance journalist. Why would you give it all up, when you've built it up from the ground as an independent? But I think she's waiting to see how they fare, and you may see her joining them perhaps in the future. I think the SDLP need to move away from attacking Sinn Féin so much and more selling what they're actually about, out rather than just going for, on the attack with regard to Sinn Féin. I think Colm and Nicola do offer strong leadership. It's a very wholesome sort of team at the top of the SDLP, but Chris is quite right there about the strength being in people like Claire Hanna and being in people like Matthew O'Toole, and they are the sort of politicians the parties will increasingly have to attract. I think that with Alliance, Stephen Farry's good on the Brexit stuff. Naomi's very ambitious, with the Greens. The Bailey bill on climate is going to be good for the Greens. Claire going forward with the buffer zones, the private members bill, that's all in the mix as well for them. But I think if you were to ask women's rights activists if Robin Swan was the most popular politician, they would give you a very different answer from a lot of other people. And also he could end up being the fall guy for the aftermath of COVID whenever all the inquiries start. So I think a lot really depends on what happens between now and then, because as we've seen from the last couple of months, you just don't know what's about to happen next. So it could be who needs taught a lesson, or where the sort of other politics are feeding into the mix. Is that message around fear going to be something that is something that brings people out? I actually think this next election is going to be really telling in it revealing who we are as a people. I think it's going to be very interesting. I haven't got any money on anybody yet. I'm going to hold off and see what happens over the next number of months. But I would be more optimistic for Alliance perhaps than some of the other contributors. But I do think that Sinn Féin will probably edge it as the largest party. And just while you were talking about Yaz there, Chris, that was the second concert I ever went to. The first one was Bros at the King's Hall with my sister in 1989 when I was 10 years old, which was quite disturbing because there was quite a lot of teenage girls throwing their underwear on stage, and then the next one after that was Jazz, so I'm very familiar with that song. And I'm 42.
Okay, so we've got just a few minutes left, and again, I'm going to limit you all to 45 seconds. Chris, tell us, what do you think do you think the executive will make it to May of next year?
Yeah, I do, because I think it's in everybody's interest at the moment for that to be the case. I think certainly Sinn Féin, the DUP, have learned that lesson from the 2019 Westminster election. They kind of took it on the chin. I know Sinn Féin had that Finucane win, but apart from that, it wasn't good for them. It certainly wasn't good for the DUP. So I think it's in both their interests to keep it going. And I don't see any other parties necessarily saying anything else, but having the narrative that we're trying to make things work as what they want to go into that election as their platform piece. Okay.
Alison, does the executive make it to I was about to say the full term, but they only came into office 3/4 of the way through the current mandate. But.
Yeah, I'd like to think they could stick it out from now next year. Yeah. I mean, the fact is, the DUP were making noises about if there's not changes to the protocol, we're going to do this and that, but they were never going to do any of those things. I mean, the fact is that just like Jeffrey Donaldson has an ear to the ground in Westminster. He knew what was coming up in relation to protocol and what the British government were going to do. So it was easy to say, I'm going to do this if, knowing that the if was going to happen, that was going to happen anyway. And I don't think that at the time when we're coming out of a pandemic, when the waiting lists are in the mess that they're in, that any politician wants to be knocking the door for a snap election, having brought down the Assembly and saying, will you vote for us, when every house whose door you knock will have someone in it who's waiting on a hip or a knee or, a cancer operation. It's just going to be disastrous for them. So no, I do think that it'll last, but I do think that we're coming. We know we've always had negotiations every 10 years, basically since the Good Friday Agreement, to have a total sort of renegotiation. We're heading towards a time where I think at some stage we're probably going to have a renegotiation about how the Assembly works and about the form of mandatory coalition. It's unsustainable in the long term. It was never meant to last this long. It was always meant to be a stopgap until we return to normal politics. And at some stage, I think we're going to have a renegotiation to try and make that a more sustainable, long-lasting form of government.
Yeah, and if you have 16 to 20 United Community MLAs, that's going to be, it's not the designation system isn't really tenable. Tim, what do you think the executive will make it till May of next year?
Well, unless there's some seismic event, and I don't really see that happening, there's little point, I think, in bringing the Assembly down now. I think, it wouldn't achieve much. I think the election's pretty much fixed now in May, whatever happens. Because I think, if you're bringing the Assembly down now, I don't think it comes back after an election, because such would the seismic event be that would lead to that happening. So, because let's say There's no mitigations around the protocol. The protocol is not renegotiated in DUP, bring the Assembly down. Well, what's going to happen? The Assembly can't come back out. Can't have an election, and that's going to make big changes to the protocol. So I just don't see it's within anybody's interest to do that now. And I think it would just be a complete waste of time unless there's some very specific issue that arises that we can't foresee.
Okay. And Amanda, I'll give the last word to you.
I'll keep it short and sweet, David, because I want to keep you in your time. I think it should survive. If it doesn't, I'll be on standby to try and explain the latest weirdness of our politics to whoever needs to hear it. But I think what's going to happen with the protocol will be interesting to watch. I think you'll probably see maybe some of the older generation, conflict generation politicians may leave the stage. And I think that all of this and all of the things that are happening right now are all part of the bigger picture around the change in demographics and the change in political landscape and looking towards what's going to be happening with the border poll. So I think that's all in the mix.
Okay, and that brings us to the end of this session of Commentators Corner. On behalf of Féile and Phobail, I want to thank you for watching and for tuning in. I also want to thank our panelists, Alison Morris, Chris Donnelly, Amanda Ferguson, and Tim Cairns. Thank you for watching.